Yeah, I mean, I'm here because, as you say, I've seen this communication thing from all sides. It's been the nature of my various media jobs in this business to see the way architects and engineers in particular present themselves and communicate their projects. If you like, sell yourselves, and if you think the idea of selling yourself seems a bit mucky, don't. As Mark was saying, I'm selling myself to you now, for instance. I have doubts about myself, whether I'll be able to get my point across to you in a way that's clear and not boring. I may fail. We all know that feeling. But you don't get anywhere if not enough of the right people know you exist. That's really the start point, isn't it? Hence the only slogan which I'm going to give you. The only slogan I'm going to give you is be discoverable. Now, when I say I've seen it from all sides, I mean, as Lucy said, I deal with architects who want their projects published in both professional and consumer media, or who are trying to persuade me on a selection panel or as an awards judge, for instance. Now, obviously, I've had a lifetime of architects physically taking me around their buildings and explaining them to me, which is great. I don't mind that, although I don't always need it. In fact, sometimes I avoid the architect if I know that they are particularly charming or silver-tongued. Best to avoid them. Piers Goff, Lorenzo Piano. And from students at architecture school through to experienced practitioners, I have experienced them presenting at concept level. So, I've also occasionally had architects begging me not to publish their buildings, which is another story, hence this splendid David Shrigley work here. I mean, how do you ignore that building? In fact, it's quite tricky controlling exposure of a building that physically exists, and it's always wrong to try to be over-controlling. And I've had plenty of experience of that, most editors have. But that's further down the line. So how do you be discoverable in the first place? I once interviewed James Sterling and asked him how he went about getting work. Thought I ought to try that one. How do you go about getting work, Jim? His reply was magnificent. Michael Wilford and I sit here, he said, and sometimes the telephone rings. Now, the fact that he went without work for years in Britain might suggest that he meant what he said, but I happen to know that he had another side to him. Now, like the very engaged and often enraged Dennis Lasden, Jim knew who he wanted to talk to in the press. He would ring up or send hand-scrawled letters, all personal. He never had any kind of PR person that I was aware of, but he disseminated the Big Jim character. Now, I don't know whether he would have liked social media, but he could have been good at it. Now, I'll come back to character as well. I've got a lot of sympathy for the view that if you do good work, then it will become known. And up to a point, that is true. There is so much terrible architecture out there. Now, you should see my inbox most days. You would weep. So much terrible architecture out there that we architecture media types pounce with cries of glee on anything that's halfway decent, let alone excellent. Even so, some good architects don't seem to want or know how to get word out. So be discoverable, as I say, but don't be needy. Give us enough to go on to pique our interest. Remind us judiciously, because we have brains like sieves and there's a lot of noise out there from other architects all the time, but don't pester us. And of course, I say of course, this should be from the Institute of the Bleeding Obvious, one thing you can never do is spin a bad or indifferent building into the media as architecture. But maybe you have another story to tell about research, sustainability, technical innovation, local involvement. There are various stories you can tell. Now, to be boring for a moment, don't be afraid of the basics. This is the RIBA's Find an Architect service. You need to keep your information up to date and looking good. We all know that. And who's that there? David Adjaye, one of the world's most successful and highly regarded architects. He dines with presidents, and his practice takes care to maintain his entry here. So he covers the bases, and so should you. Nice strip of projects when you drill down into it. Now, this is a level playing field. The template is the same for everyone. So we're still with Ajay there, but click to another practice in the A's. Journalists are lazy, by the way. I didn't go beyond the A's. Chamberlain Gaunt. You may not have heard of them. This practice won our McEwen Award this year on the RIBA Journal. They're an emerging practice, young, growing fast, Hampshire-based, about to open an office in London, and they too maintain their information here. And actually, it's them alongside Ajay. As you click through, there's the project that won the McEwen. Now, as I say, this is such basic stuff. Yet, if you have a look at Find an Architect, there are chartered practices with no information about themselves or their projects at all. So in that case, what, as a prospective client, do you have to go on and address? Now, Chamberlain Gaunt also they're just there as an example, they're not specific. Also demonstrate another useful lesson. Who are you appealing to? It's not necessarily always a conventional client. It might be a fellow architect with commissioning power. This is part of Liverpool 1, master plan by BDP. The only time, I think, that an essentially retail development got shortlisted for the Sterling Prize. If you remember, they brought in about 20 other practices to contribute buildings to the development. BDP likes to keep up to date with emerging practices. They're a big supporter of our McEwen Award for that reason, amongst others. Awards in general are just so important because if you win one, that's a quality mark which gives people a reason to find you interesting. And I'll come back to awards too. But first, exhaustion. This is Sir George Gilbert Scott. Every inch, the prosperous, successful architect there. Make sure you get yourselves properly photographed, by the way. But that's not why he's here. He's here because in the mid-1830s, he was once a struggling young architect in his 20s, and he and his even younger partner, William Bonathan Moffat, had a plan. This involved cutting-edge intelligence gathering, which they did here. Peel's Coffee House on Fleet Street. Being on Fleet Street, it had a reading room with all the local and regional papers from around the country. Unemployment was very high back then, and recently the Poor Law had been passed, which led to a spate of new workhouses being commissioned nationwide. Scott and Moffat knew about these, wanted to move in on this wave of new building, and most importantly knew they could improve the designs. Socially useful work by the standards of the day. But first they needed the commission. So at Peel's, they scoured the papers for local competitions. If they saw a likely one, they'd hop on an overnight coach, the cheap seats on the outside, to the town in question to meet the people involved and get the brief. Scott went north and east, Moffat went south and west. Then they zoomed back to London and, in Scott's words, set to work with violence. Worked day and night, back on the coaches again to present. Now, all this was just pre-railway age, pre-Victorian even, but they covered a vast amount of the country. Their designs were indeed superior, they won a lot of work, and in the 10 years they were partners, Scott and Moffat built some 50 workhouses, which were then seen as enlightened acts of local charity, paid for out of local levies on businesses. Several of them survive, often as parts of hospitals, and are now listed, such as this one in Belper, Derbyshire. Now, it's not bad for an architect who is pretty much starting out. But without their intelligence gathering in Peel's Coffee House and their readiness to drop everything and travel, they would never have landed such commissions. Scott later recalled that Moffat was a brilliant verbal presenter of their designs, which helped enormously. He wrote, "Moffat was most successful in this kind of fighting, having an instinctive perception of which men to aim at pleasing and of how to meet their views and to address himself successfully to their particular temperaments." And I wish I'd met Moffat because I have had to endure some excruciating presentations from architects who have entirely failed to read the situation or the room or even the brief. And others who appear to have that instinctive perception and who are not only interesting and inspiring, but their ideas somehow also, I think Foster has this knack, their ideas also somehow inevitable. When Scott said fighting, he didn't mean fighting the selection panel, he meant fighting the other contestants. And their work was research-backed. The pair were constantly hoovering up the experience and recommendations of their clients, this is recorded by Scott, using that to improve their designs, which meant they won more competitions, and so it went on. Now, this is key. They actively wanted to learn by doing. It was, I reckon, like Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours of practice theory. only more like 50,000 hours in their case. I don't recommend that intensive way of working because the personal cost can be too high, but I can't fault their overall plan of action. It got them work, it got them established, and whatever you think of the system they were serving 180 years ago, it allowed them to improve that building type for the public benefit. Now, today's equivalents of Peel's Coffee House are online. And obviously online is mostly how other people get to know about you in the first instance. So I'm going to show you a fruitful exchange which tells one of today's stories about how architects get noticed. Can you read that? I was going to Manchester on other business, but I posted on Facebook to ask if there are any particular buildings or architects I should see. Now, Lisa there towards the bottom, who's a good PR person in Manchester, came up with various up-and-coming architects, as you see. Others then weighed in, including Phil Coffey there at the bottom, who repeats Lisa's assertions that 6'2" architects are worth seeing. So, when I was up in Manchester, I made time to go and see one of their buildings, which was indeed pretty good. And the upshot is this final slide there. Who says social media doesn't work? I added later. And Phil goes back and reads it. So there's a kind of mutually beneficial circle going on here. And here they are, 6'2" architects profiled in this month's RIBA journal. Now, one of the interesting things about that story is that they had at no point approached us, but they had made themselves discoverable. And the social media network of recommenders, including their own peers, other architects, did the rest. None of which would have achieved anything if they were not good, but they are, so we all learn something. This comes back in a way to what Mark was saying, back to the 19th century here. Obviously one of the most famous architectural sketches in history. This is Paxton's blotting paper doodle of the Crystal Palace, section and elevation. It tells you such a lot. And it cured a big headache for the promoters of the Great Exhibition by making plain how a very large building could be procured at low cost using what we would now call off-site techniques. And as we said, one of the most powerful tools in your locker is the explanatory sketch done on the spot. Now, as an occasional client myself, I can tell you that this beats everything. You can talk all you want, show as many pictures as you want, but when an architect just produces a sketch pad or a phone and shows you in a drawing, there on the spot, then respect. This is where architects can do that thing of being effortlessly competent, or at any rate, seeming to be effortlessly competent. It's the best communication even when it's staged, and we mentioned the practice that can go into it. Yep, some of the biggest names in the business do that. So you're trained to do this, the rest of us are not. Use that skill. Examples here, Peter Barber sketch explaining a complete housing development in a few lines. Joe Duggan of Duggan Morris using the same magic. It's all there. The full fat render is one thing, but this, done on the spot can be more persuasive. Now, I mentioned how important it is to use the award system. It really does work. An award gives people a reason to put you on their shortlist rather than someone else. It's not just your building that does this for you. It's the company it keeps. It's as if all these other great buildings around yours were silently recommending you. And this is from an AJ Awards special. We're producing our special RIBA Awards journal, RIBA Journal Awards issue now for June. Now, it is true that there are way too many awards now. Some of them are just cynical ways to get cash off you, but these and a handful of others are the mother lode, really. Why? Not least because awards spill out of the profession. They give consumer publications easy features. They look for the awards to get ideas, in the property section specifically here. This is a typical story from the Sunday Times home section. Of course, as we all know, there's a ceaseless hunger for one-off houses and clever conversions. If only the papers and glossy mags were as keen on new doctors' surgeries and infant schools and social housing, but they're not. Another Sunday Times story, Benson and Forsyth in St Albans, interestingly not a one-off house for a change. Learn their language. The property sections talk in a different language from the architecture critics. It's worth studying that language, even if you hate it, because the emphasis is nearly always on the user rather than the designer, and that's important. Design, of course, interesting that many architects and designers use it almost as a bulletin board. They post their projects there. Of course, the projects had to be accepted by the editorial team. But many other publications follow up from this. If you've seen it on Dezeen, then that's a kind of pre-sift and a quality check, almost like an award in itself. It's very international in outlook, but they are by no means averse to good small projects, I find. And because they're in a world of design, the design of their own site is worth studying as a lesson in communicating and compartmenting a lot of material, which brings us to that business of architects' own websites, your front door, essentially. Now, this, to me, is just all wrong. I mean, Renzo Piano, for heaven's sake. There is so much you could say about the work and character and ideas of Renzo. But presumably because he's pretty old now, the Renzo Piano Building Workshop homepage has gone all corporate. I find this boastful and off-putting. Not that boastfulness is necessarily wrong. See here. Studio Weave has got the tone exactly right for Twitter. Their character is to be irreverent, whimsical, but again, effortlessly competent, breezy with it. The message here actually is exactly the same as that homepage for the Renzo Piano Building Workshop. We can do anything, anywhere, but done with tongue-in-cheek. Now, when you get, I won't show it to you, but when you get to Studio Weave's very good website, it's a dynamic thing that moves, so no point on the slide. You'll find things like their knitted panel of experts. You may have seen their knitted panel of experts. These are hand-knitted soft toys who apparently assess every project. So Studio Weave is taking the piss out of the cult of the overpaid consultant and the design review panel, but in a way which makes you love them rather than dismiss them as arrogant. Now, this is terribly easy to get wrong, but they don't. At the more corporate end of things, I tend to recommend any firm of architects to study the way AHMM communicates. They're a very big practice now, of course, much bigger than Renzo Piano's, in fact, but they have always set great store by communication and image. They do this through PR, through a digital presence such as this, by publications and events, and by personal contact. If I go to see one of their projects, it will be the partner who shows me around. They also work with very good graphic designers. Now, note that their lead story on the page I took this screenshot from was not a building, but about the launch of one of their self-published books. The other architect who self-publishes a lot is Norman Foster. It's vanity publishing, of course, so don't expect many reviews, and it's expensive, but it's a useful marketing tool and an invaluable record of what you do. So we scroll through their news section, new planning permission they record there, and now, again, see how highly they rate even being shortlisted for the RIBA awards. In fact, I think AHMM are more assiduous at entering awards than any other practice I know. They enter absolutely everything. But they are big enough to have a comms department, of course, which handles all that, and there's always someone at the ceremony to pick up the award. They're never a no-show. And then finally, through the projects page, onto the Burntwood School, Sterling Prize winner. Always excellent photography. It's rare that you'd visit the AHMM site, whatever you think about their architecture, it's rare that you'd visit the AHMM site and not find what you were after. But it needs resources on a continuing basis to keep it all going, and the bigger the practice, the more that is true. Getting known through speculative work. Towards the end here now, by the way. There are many ways to get known. In this practice, Rick Mather Architects has always been somewhat diffident, I guess, after the character of its late founder. But here you see another example of what architects can do. In this case, imagine Heathrow Airport if it was closed and turned into a new town. It was a commission from the Thames Estuary Airport people, and other practices also came up with ideas. Now, the chances of this being built, of course, are effectively zero. But Mathers are good at master planning, and they know the value of a what-if project. They tell me that since this, they have received a number of TfL commissions for master planning dense new housing developments around transport hubs. In fact, they've compiled a book of these for TfL. So people are receptive to good, bold ideas. And again, it's that effortless competence. You have a problem? Here's what the answer could be. It's reassuring. And it can work very well on a local level. Every locality has an urban problem or a fine empty building or such like. It's worth doing. And publicising a self-generated project from time to time. Be the people's friend. So that project which you generate for yourself probably won't happen, but it will register your name with people as experts and solvers of problems. So they might well return to you, as TfL returned to Mather. And like competitions, it's a kind of ideas generation for the practice. You never know when these ideas are going to come in useful. And finally, enough digital stuff. I mentioned the power of the on-the-spot sketch. Don't be afraid of the analog. We saw Norman Foster with his boards there, pretty much working in the same way that John Soane worked, actually, I thought, when I saw that presentation. You can make a model out of a log with a chainsaw, and everyone will stop to look and wonder at it. This happens to be from the Japanese house exhibition running at the Barbican, well worth a visit. It's of the 1997 Leek House by Teranobu Fujimori, but it could be anything. It's an arresting object. It shows flair and imagination and wit, and above all, character. And that's vital. Every practice has a distinctive character, but that doesn't always come across too well as a kind of homogenizing thing that happens, particularly with online material. You have to determine what that character is. It's usually driven by the personalities of the key people. We saw Studio Weave and how they do that. And then use all means at your disposal to communicate that. And above all, whether you're talking to the media or selection panels or design review or planners or clients, use plain English. Be as intelligent as you are, not condescending, but conversational. Do not obviously show off. Do not retreat into architectural jargon. You know, spaces, units, party. No one understands what party means. Or possibly even worse, developer hoarding speak. Vibrant, vision, passionate. Cliches. And also, it's great to have inspiration, to show inspiration, to give references. But just think about leaving your mid-century modern heroes out of it, because everyone always cites the same three. Can you imagine in 1917, Edwin Lutyens, say, might be Beresford Pike, might be Blomfield Holden, but one of that gang of brilliant architects. 1917, the war's on, but they're looking beyond the war, there's projects. Can you imagine them presenting a scheme where they say, I'd like it to be quite like this thing from 1850? They'd be shown the door politely, they really would. Your references are quite often references which drive you on, what Lasdon called your personal myth. You don't necessarily have to share that personal myth with a potential client, because it might look like you haven't got any ideas of your own, possibly. Just as every medieval monarch needed a food taster to avoid poison, so a lot of architects need someone, even if it's an imagined someone inside their heads, who can convert their words from a private to a public language, which comes back to really one of the first points and one of the points which Mark made also. Let people know that it's about them, not about you. Thank you very much.